Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us on what I think is a topic that many people have asked us about, and we apologize for having to push it out somewhat, but we wanted to make sure we could provide you with a relevant and highly valuable session, which we hope this is what you'll take away from here. So obviously, as the title says, our presentation today is around medical device security and the myths related to that. And specifically, we hear often that hospitals have a lot of challenges when it comes to securing medical devices. And so really what we want to do is focus on how much of that is a myth, how much of what you may hear from a medical device manufacturer's representative in that you can't patch, or you can't change things, or they can't do things, is reality versus obviously myth. So let's jump into that. This is probably going to be somewhat of a shorter presentation just because I think it's a pretty focused topic. That said, I am more than happy to stay on as long as you guys wish to answer questions, talk about scenarios, and whatever you may find valuable. So even though we, may not have a lot of content to present, please don't think that not open to interacting and taking your feedback and thoughts on what we go through here. So I want to start off with FDA and just talk a little bit about them and some things that have changed that you may or may not be aware of. So on December 29th, 2022, there was a new law that was signed into effect. And that law, long and short of it, authorizes FDA, or provides FDA, is maybe a better way to put it, with certain regulatory powers. And I think this is very important to understand and to begin here, because it may help provide some context for some of you wondering about what is FDA's role in all of this regarding cybersecurity and medical devices. So this law that went into effect basically provides FDA with the authority to do three things as a regulatory requirement, right? And in the past, what we really thought about and talked about was pre and post-market guidance, especially when it came to cybersecurity. And it may sound semantical and, that we're splitting hairs on the words, but guidance and regulatory are vastly different, right? So what happened after this law went in effect is that FDA is saying you have to, as a medical device manufacturer, submit a plan on how you will monitor and address post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities, right? And by post-market, just so we're all on the same page, we mean those once the device has been released into the market and is commercially available. So before that occurs, the medical device manufacturer has to now submit a plan to FDA, and FDA can review that and then make a determination if that plan is appropriate for the current threat landscape. The second thing is that the medical device manufacturer for the specific medical device has to be able to demonstrate that they've designed and they've deployed and developed and are maintaining processes to assure that after the device is in the marketplace, it can be updated from a cybersecurity perspective, right? So that's kind of the second leg of the stool in terms of this regulation. And the third one, which is a really big one and has taken really years to figure out, is the requirement for medical device manufacturers to provide a software bill of materials, or what we more commonly would refer to as an SBOM. And this SBOM has to not only detail the commercial software or technologies being used by a medical device manufacturer, but also anything else they're relying on in terms of open source or specialized libraries or off-the-shelf technology that make up that medical device. So ultimately, I think that what both FDA, HHS, and government are trying to do is really call to attention the fact that medical device manufacturers now have a legal requirement to assure that their device is as secure as possible, and to assure that the facilities are there to update devices, and that also they can quickly identify if any of the components of the device may be become vulnerable or could be exploitable. And so that's what that regulatory authority does, and that's what has given FDA a lot of newfound authority to go ahead and put these things in place. And I think it's important to understand that because many of us may have been under the impression that these things were in place prior to December 29, 2022, and that medical device manufacturers were required to do all these things. And so, that was kind of true, but from a guidance perspective and not a regulatory perspective. So one of the things that occurred after this law went into effect is FDA came back out and said, hey, listen, we get that for some medical device manufacturers, this is going to be a large hill to climb, and you may have not done these things yet. So we're going to give you kind of sort of a 90-day grace period, right, to October 1st, 2023. And please, one thing I should say in here, and I forgot to put this in the slides, I'll just make this comment right now as a general disclaimer. One, everything we're providing you here is for your informational purposes, right? So I am not an attorney. CloudWave does not represent any organization legally, and there's no warranty or guarantee on the information I'm providing you or the information. So you have to take what we tell you and verify and validate through your own sources. And secondly, I am not speaking on behalf of FDA. So again, you should do your own research. So before I go further with that, I wanted to make sure that we put that disclaimer out there. So FDA basically said, as I was mentioning, that, hey, medical device manufacturers, you have till October 1st to comply with these new regulatory requirements. There was some confusion in the marketplace, right? In the past, there's this concept of refuse to accept, where a medical device manufacturer, for a variety of different reasons, can say, hey, we're not going to accept that decision, or we're not going to accept that guidance. And somehow or another, in the medical device side of the world, the medical device manufacturers interpreted this grace period, if you will, that FDA put in place as well, we can refuse to do this. We can go look at what we have to do, and if it's too onerous, we don't have to do it. We'll just do a refuse to accept. And just to be clear, that is not what FDA was trying to say. FDA was just basically saying, you got 90 days to figure out how you're going to comply with this new regulation, and there is no refuse to accept. The regulation is not optional. You have to do this. Now, I want to provide a caveat so we're all very clear on this before you run out to your medical device manufacturers and start telling them, hey, you by law have to do this. This law only applies to new products that are coming into the market. So if you have an MRI or a CAT scan or smart pump that is been released prior to the effective date of this law, it's not covered with this, right? And so that is a challenge, right? And it's maybe not what as a hospital you would hope for, and you probably were hoping that all medical devices, regardless of when they were designed, developed, and deployed, would fall under this regulation, but there has to be a middle of the road. And obviously there's some challenges that this can present, because you could have medical device manufacturers say, well, if if you want the secure device, you're going to have to purchase the new product. And I'm paraphrasing that. I don't think medical device manufacturers would directly say that to you. And later on, I'm going to give you some tactics that you can use if for some reason some medical device manufacturer does say that. Maybe not that directly, but in some other terms. So that's kind of the regulatory landscape and kind of what FDA brings from their side of the table. We'll talk more about FDA as we get into some of the myths, right? But I just wanted to at least give you that foundation in terms of the new regulatory authority, the refuse to accept, and some of the misinterpretation from medical device manufacturers into the fact that maybe they can refuse to accept this regulation, which they cannot. So I want to now switch to the hospital and talk about what is the healthcare organization's responsibilities. Now, I can tell you the first workshop I attended with FDA on this topic of medical device cybersecurity was back in 2014. And I think there were about 120 or so people from different groups that had attended this workshop. I think it was a 2-day workshop sponsored by FDA. And one of the key things that came up, almost in sometimes in very heated debates during breakout sessions and other things, was who is responsible for what, right? Like, well, isn't this the medical device manufacturer's responsibility, or no, that's the hospital's responsibility? And I think that has continued, that entire debate, whether it's a silent debate or an active debate, it is contributed to a lot of the myths and contributed to a lot of the misunderstanding around medical device security and who's ultimately responsible. So hopefully this will clear that up. Ultimately, the security of the medical device once you bring it into your hospital and you've connected it to a network or a patient, you are responsible, right? You cannot point to the medical device manufacturer and say, well, they provided a insecure device. Now I'm going to clean that up a little bit, but I just kind of want to just cut through all the noise and make sure that we walk away from here that you understand that you're responsible for the security of that device and typically and the associated safety with patients, right? So, and I'll get into things like patching and upgrading and all of that. So when we look at this from a, priority perspective, your responsibility as the hospital is to ensure that medical device's cybersecurity configuration does not do anything to introduce a patient safety issue, right? So if I can get into that device and somehow change an order set or change a calculation or mess with an image or a diagnostic result, and that introduces patient safety, then it's my responsibility as the hospital, right? So number one is you have to assure that any security issue does not impact patient safety. Second of all is the security of the overall environment, right? So your network, your entire environment has to be secure to begin with. So it's very hard to make a case that the device was insecure if the environment is also insecure, right? So first, and these are in priority order, right? So first thing, we got to assure the patient safety is not compromised by any cybersecurity vulnerability, especially medical device cybersecurity. Secondly, we got to make sure that whatever that device is attaching to is secure, right? And there's no gray area there, right? Like it's either secure or it's not, and you know your network better than anybody else, so you know how real of bad a statement that is. But that is the second piece from our perspective that you would have to make sure you can attest to, that yes, our network was secure. The third piece here is then securing the medical device, making sure the medical device itself is secure. And I kind of want to make sure that we all understand this priority list, because I think we start with the medical device. That's what I've seen over the past few years when I'm talking to clinical engineering teams or C-suites or IT teams or IT security, is we all start with the medical device. And my response to that is often like, well, before we even go there, how secure is your network, right? Well, we're pretty secure. We try to keep up on patch management. Like, so everything 100% patched, all your holes plugged, is your external pen test, internal pen test, all showing that you guys are locked down? Are you doing continuous monitoring? You have all layered in depth security plate and put in place? Do you have honeypots? Like, is all that there, right? And again, I don't know your environments, but that's where we start the conversation, right? And so if your answer to me on that is yes, we're 100% locked down, we're good. Then the second conversation we need to have when we're thinking about medical device security is, great, so how safe is the patient? Is there anything within this medical device or the network that would compromise patient safety? If the answer to that is also no, we're good there, right? Then we should be thinking about medical device security. But in patching a medical device and thinking that is the last that is the last line of defense, right? Is basically what I'm trying to say, that the security of that medical device should be the last line of defense, right? If we think about a smart pump, and we think about that smart pump being 100% patched, that poor little smart pump is acting as the last line of defense. What we're saying is, if everything else in our environment fails and an attacker gets in and is able to traverse our network and discover that smart pump and they attempt to go after it, they can't do anything to it. That's the last line of defense. So the big thing we have to think about from medical device security is, what are our first lines of defense and our second line of defense before an attacker gets to that medical device? So hopefully this is helping reshape how you're thinking. And again, I'm not saying we should not be focused on the specific medical device and the security of that device. I'm just saying, do not think about this in terms of, well, the medical device is insecure, that's not my fault, I couldn't patch it, so I have no responsibility here. You ultimately do, whether you can patch that device or not. The last piece here in terms of responsibilities is informing the patient. And this is an area that's really important to think about and understand. We have seen, and I've talked about this in other presentations, we have seen situations that have led to civil liability where hospitals have not done a good job of informing patients or family members or whoever the power of attorney is that the medical devices being used in their treatment may be susceptible to cybersecurity risks. and make that as part of informed consent. And that's really important to do, because ultimately, if you're not disclosing that risk to the patient, they can't make an informed consent. And the cases we've seen have then become very successful civil litigation, right? Where the patient, something happened, or they weren't, because they weren't informed, and they would have made a different decision, and that leads to a negative civil outcome, a civil liability outcome for the hospital. So when we think about informed consent, and this is something that FDA did speak about, I think back in 2015 or 16, I believe Susan Schwartz from FDA did a blog posting on this topic of hospitals should consider informing patients about the potential risks related to medical device security as part of informed consent. And so there's actually, if you Google it, you can see a picture of the screen image here. There is actually a document out there on best practices for communicating cybersecurity vulnerabilities to patients that was drafted by FDA. And so I implore you to go check that out and think about how you can incorporate some of those best practices into your practice. But I think the big thing here is you need to review and update your informed consent policy. And you need to test that patient communication strategy. And by test, what I mean is if you go do a tabletop, part of that tabletop should be exploring, well, okay, if you have a cyber event and that cyber event has impacted medical devices, how are we communicating that to patients and family members or other empowered individuals on behalf of the patient, so that the best decision can be made by that patient? Now, the challenge here is that most of what I'm talking about right now with this topic falls outside the scope of clinical engineering, biomed, or IT. So it is important that you have these conversations with others, especially if you represent IT security, because most executives in a hospital are not thinking about informed consent in line with cybersecurity vulnerabilities and medical device vulnerabilities. So it's important you have this as part of your strategy, right, as one of the key elements that we talked about in the HCO responsibilities. So I think the ultimate thing to keep in mind here when you're thinking about healthcare organization responsibilities is that the security or insecurity of a medical device, although it needs to be addressed, the compensating controls and the network, the infrastructure that you put in place has to be secure, because it's considered all one from the perspective of liability, right? It's not, well, the medical device was insecure, right? So let's start talking about myths. The first myth that I hear a lot is that the FDA is the federal entity solely responsible for the security of medical devices. And in actuality, there's some truth and not truth in that. FDA is responsible for medical device security in terms of the manufacturing process and the subsequent management of that device by the manufacturer in the marketplace. So they are not responsible for you as the hospital, right? They don't have any regulatory authority over the hospital, right? So they can't tell you how to configure it, how to manage it, or what to do. In fact, I would argue that FDA's, expertise and knowledge don't really focus on hospital security, right? And how to manage and deal with that. In fact, it's been a challenge over the past 5, 6, 7 years when an exploit comes out or a vulnerability comes out about how to actually support hospitals from the FDA, because that is a new area for them. It's not what they're really designed to do or empowered to do. And even if we look at the regulations I mentioned earlier, you can, one of the reasons I wanted to introduce that to you is those regulations don't apply to hospitals, right? They apply to the manufacturer. And I think as hospitals, I often see that there's a belief that, well, FDA should be helping us, or FDA should be telling us what to do, or FDA should be publishing the best practices. I think FDA is trying to do that. But if we think about what FDA does day to day, it is really focused from a medical device perspective on dealing with those manufacturers and trying to protect and secure those devices at the source, if you will. Doesn't mean that in the future you may not see FDA provide best practices or recommendations, but again, it's more of guidance than regulatory authority. The second one is FDA tests for cybersecurity of medical devices. Now, this may change with the upcoming regulation, or not upcoming, the current regulation that's been put in place, but I think there has been for a long time this belief that medical devices are somehow sent from the manufacturer to FDA, or like a bunch of FDA people come in like blue jackets with gold FDA letters to the medical devices manufacturers' offices and run a bunch of cybersecurity tests. And that doesn't occur, right? Again, maybe this is going to change as part of the regulatory changes, but ultimately what has happened, and I would bet is going to happen because this would be very hard to scale, is that device manufacturers have to provide proof, right? If we think about what that regulation says, it's provide proof of plans, proof of processes, right? Demonstrate that they have procedures and architecture in place to support upgrades and vulnerability patching, right? But they're not actually running pen tests. The FDA is not coming in and running pen tests on these devices. They're looking for that proof, and then the onus is on that medical device manufacturer to assure that they're being completely truthful and transparent in terms of what their cybersecurity strategies and policies are. Now, that is being reviewed, and I'm sure FDA would provide commentary and guidance on whether that's acceptable for the current threat landscape or not. But ultimately, we need to understand that, you know, those plans and all of that is on the shoulders of the medical device manufacturers to now meet that regulatory requirement. And if we think about legacy medical devices, a lot of that has been, you know, addressed through pre and post market guidance, especially the pre-market guidance, right, on what medical device manufacturers should be doing and not doing. So, you know, I think also that speaks to who's responsible then for testing the device. And I think part of that does lie on the hospital's responsibility. You're bringing something into your environment that you ultimately are responsible for patient safety and the systems that are used to treat and manage that patient. So if that's coming into your environment, you may want to consider how do you run some form of vulnerability assessment or risk assessment as part of that process, right? And that is something we can help with, right? We do have an entire medical device security program and pen testing programs and all of those things that can help. So just keep that in mind. This myth, the next one, is probably one of the biggest ones everybody gets frustrated from, and it's typically goes something like this. Like you find a medical, you know, you bring us in, we find a bunch of vulnerabilities, or you find a vulnerability with a medical device on your own, or one gets put into the marketplace, and in terms of intelligence, and you're alerted to one, and you then go to the medical device manufacturer, and you say, hey, this device has a vulnerability, and we'd like to patch it. And the device manufacturer tells you, well, you know, you can't patch it, right? And some other part of that conversation will be something like, well, if you patch it, you're going to violate the warranty. Or if you patch it, you know, we can't patch it because we'd have to go through FDA recertification, which is the 510K clearance. And, you know, there's typically some dialogue that takes place like that, right? So you as the hospital get frustrated because you're trying to do the right thing, protect the patient, protect your network, and protect the environment. And now you're kind of hit this wall where the, you know, medical device manufacturers pulling out the rule book and telling you, well, you can't do that because of FDA. So let's clear this up. First of all, that's not true. You can patch devices. Typically what I have seen and when that dialogue occurs is that you are speaking to a field engineer or salesperson, and they are trying to do what they think is right, or they may believe is the right thing because they kind of sort of understand 510K, or they kind of sort of understand pre and post market guidance or the new regulations, and they're not really truly fully informed on the reality. So we'll talk more about what you should do in these situations. I guess right now I just want to leave it at that this is a myth. Both the manufacturer and the hospital can apply patches. Now, do you have a means to apply the patch? That's a whole different conversation, right? Like you may not be as easy to patch a MRI as it is to patch a Windows desktop. And so that may be a different conversation, right? You want to patch it, and the medical device manufacturer is telling you, well, to do that, you're going to need one of our field engineers because you don't have access to the device, or things of that nature, right? But in terms of can you patch medical devices, you can. The only asterisk I'll put on that is that you just have to assure that whatever you're doing is not going to impact the operation of that device, right? And what did I say earlier? Patient safety is number one. And whose responsibility is patient safety? The hospitals. So could you patch? Yes, you can. Are you going to be liability free if you put in a patch and something happens? No. And is the manufacturer responsible for that liability? No, because you added the patch. So those conversations and what level of risk tolerance you have associated to that is something you're going to have to really think about. And I'm going to give you a means of thinking about patching in just a moment to help hopefully give you some guidance on this. And so the next patch is the same thing, right? Like the next myth is the same sort of conversation. I think the last myth was really focused on having to recertify and re-go through 510K. You don't have to go through 510K all the time just because you're adding a patch. There has to be a demonstrable change in the overall submission of that medical device's operation in order to trigger a recertification of 510K. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Like if you're adding a patch, you're not significantly changing how that device operates, right? So to keep it very simple, if we have a smart pump, and the smart pump is obviously, well, let me take a different example, because smart pumps, sometimes not everybody's aware of what they do. Let's just say an MRI. So if you have an MRI and the MRI is taking images of patients and you need to apply a patch to that MRI machine, and that patch is not going to change how images are being done and processed and managed, then there's no reason for 510K recertification. Now, if suddenly, somehow, you were going to add a patch that changed how that system is doing its image processing and acquisition, then yes, certainly at that point, you would have to do a 510K clearance. But I guess the takeaway for you on this is if somebody says to you, well, we can't do that because it would require 510K clearance, then your next question to that person is say, okay, well, take me through how that's why. What exactly is requiring that? And in most cases, if somebody's telling you or using that 510K card, they're not going to be able to come up with a reason why a security patch is going to require or trigger a 510K clearance. Could it? Maybe, but it's very rare. So that's kind of, I guess, the point I want to make. But these are basically the myths. You can patch, and it doesn't always require a 510K clearance or recertification. So that brings me to, well, how do you know what to patch, and how do you quantify risk? And I think this is something we've introduced at Sensato and CloudWave in the way we do asset valuation. And I actually had a conversation with FDA about this a couple of weeks ago, actually this week and last week, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this. So what I'm going to give you here is something to think about. You can certainly apply this. We use asset valuation whenever we value assets within a hospital. We use a scale of 1 to 5. And I found this as I was doing research for this presentation, which is IEC 62304. Now, you don't really need to know what IEC 62304 is, other than it's a set of specifications that medical device manufacturers can adopt in order to hopefully design and develop secure medical devices. And so think about it as like NIST or high trust for medical device manufacturers. Now, within that specification or that classification, there is a way to classify medical device vulnerabilities. And as I was researching this, I think this is really a great place for hospitals to think about medical device vulnerabilities. So if we go back to what are your responsibilities, and number one is patient safety, we have to have a tool that kind of can help us quantify, is there a threat to patient safety? And this classification does that. So when you look at a medical device vulnerability, if you found out tomorrow that smart pump A or smart pump XYZ has a vulnerability, one of the very first things that I would suggest you start thinking about doing is putting in a process that says, okay, let's quantify that vulnerability. So that vulnerability, according to IEC 62304, could be quantified in this way. A class A vulnerability means that, you know what, this patch is not going to create some type of threat or injury to the patient, right? There's no injury or damage to health, right? So I'll give you some examples of these in a moment. A class B is there could be an injury or a negative outcome, but it's not going to be serious. It's not life-threatening. And a class C vulnerability would be something where, hey, if some attacker gets a hold of this, they're going to really, potentially kill the patient, right? Or cause serious long-term bodily injury or harm. Now, what we're trying to get through here, and I'm going to say very, very quickly that I don't think this is exactly perfect, but what we're trying to do is get away from the notion that you should prioritize vulnerabilities based on the CVE scores, right, or CVSS, right? That we shouldn't be looking at in healthcare as, well, this is a low priority vulnerability, that's a high priority vulnerability, so we're going to patch all the highs but not the lows. What we really need to be thinking about, and I think is kind of a really important thing to start putting in place, is what is the threat of this vulnerability to the patient? Because now if we do ever have a breach and we go 18 months into the future and there's a civil suit, right, that's brought against the hospital, you have a way to explain how did you, triage and understand the impact of this vulnerability to the patient. So I could have a low priority vulnerability, right? But it could be a class C vulnerability, depending on how it's exploited, that could cause serious patient injury, right? So I'll give you a little example of like a class A, right? Like, because some of you are going to say, well, how is not any vulnerability a class C? Any vulnerability could cause, a serious death or injury to the patient. And that's not really true, right? So if you have a medical device, let's say go back to our MRI, and that MRI has a console, right, where we go ahead and view the images and we're able to, assure that the patient we're dealing with is lined up to the right image and we can manage the MRI machine. So let's say that image viewer and the controls and everything are written in JavaScript, right? And it's basically under the covers of a web page, and that's what's being used. And we suddenly learn that there's a JavaScript vulnerability out there. And that JavaScript vulnerability allows people that if you can exploit that JavaScript vulnerability, it allows you to change the fonts on the screen. So I think we can all agree that changing the fonts on the screen, if you got to that level of exploit, is not going to be a class C or a class B vulnerability. It's a class A, right? It's still a vulnerability. It still involves a medical device, but probably not going to have any damage to patient safety. Now, if we take that same example and we up the vulnerability and we say, well, one of the things that you could do is manipulate the images. So now, and this actually is a real attack that occurred in Israel, where I can now somehow, using that vulnerability, add a tumor in the image of the patient, even though they don't have a tumor. Well, that's probably a class B, right? That's injury is possible. I guess we could argue whether or not it's serious, but the idea here is not an immediate impact to patient safety, right? And then class C would be an immediate impact. And in an MRI, that would be really hard to do, right? Like at that point, we're talking Jason Bourne stuff or Mr. Robot stuff, right? Like somehow this vulnerability is going to allow me to pivot within the MRI, spin up the magnet, somehow take the magnet off of its trajectory and explode the MRI, right? That's a crazy vulnerability. Hopefully nobody ever figures out how to do. But my point on that is, what I'm trying to get you comfortable with is your first thing that you should be thinking about is, what class of vulnerability are we talking here? Forget whether it's low, medium, high. Think about it in terms of the patient. Now, we're not talking about other assets in the environment today. We're just talking about medical devices. But I would also implore you to think about anything else connected to your environment. So your EMRs are probably class B or class C. So any vulnerability, low, medium, or high, that impacts an EMR should be patched immediately, right? So same thing here with medical devices. If you have a class A, you may not need to patch it right away. Class B, probably need to patch it as quickly as possible. Class C, you're probably thinking taking this device offline. So using this helps kind of create a framework that allows us to make, patient-focused decisions versus asset-focused decisions, which is what vulnerability scoring typically does. So hopefully this made sense. And obviously, if you want to talk more about it, happy to do so. Or we could do a separate session on how do you actually implement something of this nature. But I think this is really important because as you have conversations with medical device manufacturers or you are looking to patch devices, it creates a framework for getting everybody on the same page and thinking about how you're going to qualify the risk of that vulnerability. And again, I want to just reiterate, this is not an official position by FDA in terms of this is how you should do it. I don't know if there ever will be an official position. I think there will be practices or guidance or recommendations on, hey, you should have a way to score vulnerabilities by impact to patient versus vulnerability scoring that we traditionally have used. So what do you do? Right? Let's say you find a vulnerability, you've classified it, you're sitting there going, hey, this is a class C, this is going to kill somebody, right? If an attacker exploits this is a bad day for everyone. Or even if it's a class A or B, what do you do with those, right? Well, first thing is you can talk to the medical device security team, but what I would tell you is if your hospital has a chief quality officer, you need to educate them. Before you ever see a cybersecurity vulnerability related to a medical device, they need to understand everything in this presentation, If you don't have a chief quality officer for the hospital and you have a CMO and a CNO, they need to understand that medical device security classifications and the entire focus on medical device security, vulnerabilities, and all of that is their responsibility. It is probably not the responsibility of the CIO, the CISO, or clinical engineering. And I'm sure people want to debate that, but if you go to court and you decide that, hey, this is a class C medical device vulnerability or a class A or a low priority vulnerability, you're going to have a really hard time in court when that attorney starts asking you questions about the patient's medical condition and how you knew that that was a low priority vulnerability based on your medical knowledge. So anything to do with cybersecurity vulnerabilities and the priority of patching them and how they're classified is got to be a decision made by a clinician. So you need to think about that in your organization, and you need to bring them into these conversations and ultimately share the news with them, good or bad, that guess what? You're responsible for deciding how we're going to, the priority of this and putting together the case of, we need to patch this or not. So that's job one before you go outside of your organization and call anybody else. Two is, you may run into walls, and I've described one of these before when you're talking to a field engineer or salesperson for a medical device manufacturer, and they come at you with, well, we can't do that because of 510K, or we can't do that because you can't patch it, or you'll void the warranty, or whatever it may be. So what I would suggest is pretty much every medical device manufacturer I know of, from small ones to very large ones, have a medical device manufacturer product security team. This is not the enterprise CIO or the IT security team for the medical device manufacturer. This is the team or the person who is responsible for the security of the product, right, from the medical device manufacturer. I can tell you I have yet to meet any medical device manufacturer's product security team that has not said, yes, you can patch that, or not been very aggressive in terms of, wanting people to patch things. So if you're not getting that guidance or support from the field engineering group, the sales engineering teams, you need to find a way to reach out to that product management security team. And that could be as simple as telling the field engineer or salesperson, you know what, I want to call with your product management security team. Or if they say, well, we don't have that, say, well, whoever's in charge of product security or product quality and compliance for your organization, I want to have a call with them, right? So that's another line of defense you have that you can do it. And I'm giving you these in order of gravity. So you can jump to the end of these, but hopefully you can, kind of build up a relationship. This next one is really kind of the next, nail in the coffin for the medical device manufacturer, and that is to go to your legal counsel. If you believe that you have a vulnerability in a medical device that is whatever classification, it's something you have to decide what your risk tolerance is. So that I can't tell you do this if it's a class C or class A. Do it if you feel it's appropriate. And that is go to your legal counsel and advise your legal counsel, your corporate counsel, to write a letter documenting this vulnerability to the medical device manufacturer and informing them that you believe a patient safety issue exists, and if there is a negative outcome related to that patient cybersecurity vulnerability, that you will take action against the medical device manufacturer. I have seen that we have used this, and we've had clients use this tactic, and it very quickly gets resolution, or at least you get an answer as to if there is a challenge, why, in a very, very mature, non-emotional response to, hey, this is why we can't patch it, or this is why we can, or here's what we're doing. So use your legal counsel to help you if you need to get to that point. Now, given the new regulations, you can go to MedWatch, which is this screen that you see here. You can just Google FDA MedWatch. There's a button there to self-report an issue. I would use this if it's a non-critical issue that you're seeing from a security perspective. It is monitored and people will take action. But if you really have a situation, I don't have it in here. Sorry, I didn't put it in the slides. But if you have a situation where you feel you're not getting anywhere with the medical device manufacturer, you do believe this is a true safety issue, you can inform FDA directly. I don't have it in here. I'll make sure that Laura has the email address to send you guys, where you can send an email directly to FDA, and their team that is focused on cybersecurity will see that email. I'm not going to guarantee they're going to reply back to you. They usually will, but I can guarantee you, and I have a lot of faith in the fact that they will take action on that medical device manufacturer. By action, I want to clarify, they're going to reach out and try to determine what is going on, and then they're going to decide, yes, you know what, this needs to be patched. And this is important to know because you may have found something that nobody else is aware of. And if you do come up with something, FDA does want to know, right? So that they can assure that there's, that the devices that are in the marketplace are safe. So if you found something and that medical device manufacturer is not responding, then FDA wants to get involved. And especially with the new regulatory authority that they have, it's actually given them teeth to be able to do things. So I will make sure we get you that email address. A couple things just as we wrap up here. We do have what we call the medical device cybersecurity field manual. And that field manual is, I think it's 30, 40 pages, if not more, but it goes into how to stand up a full medical device security program. It's pretty detailed. If you'd like a copy of it, you can get one by emailing customersfirst@gocloudwave.com. Again, I'll just tell you that, that is if you want to stand up your own. We have a full medical device security program that goes well beyond just monitoring and goes much more into things like incident response and best practices and the legal and liability aspects. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to hear from you and talk to you more about that. And then there's a survey coming out. We're trying to flirt with the idea of possibly holding some type of an event in 2024 in the springtime. So if you haven't seen the survey, there'll be a link to it in the chat. Please, fill it out if you're interested, or even if you're not. We want to hear like, hey, this would be a great idea. We're thinking of doing something where we get people in person for a day or two and kind of do like a really deep dive on all things healthcare security, do some hands-on labs, hopefully make it a lot of fun for people. We actually created this event back in 2013 and 14, and we used to do it here in New Jersey, but we're looking at other venues. But it is we try to make it as valuable as possible and really kind of go deep on a variety of different topics, from incident response to tabletops to a bunch of other stuff. So look for that. And then that's all I had. So I don't know if you guys have questions. I'm hoping this was valuable to you. If you'd like a copy of the slides, we can get those to you. But I think a big takeaway is get your clinicians involved, get them to understand that, this is really a lot of their responsibility to understand this and help you classify things so that you can take the appropriate actions to protect the environment and the patients. And lastly, what I'll mention, if you feel like, hey, a presentation of this nature, maybe less technical, would be good for, our clinicians, then please reach out to Laura or customersfirst@gocloudwave.com and let us know that that is something you'd like to see. And maybe we put together a presentation like this where we open it up to clinical staff and get them, and we can help you kind of champion that message to them. So with that, Laura, I don't know if we have any questions or not, but that's kind of everything I had for you guys today.
We did have one question come in. It's regarding the healthcare delivery organization's patching. You stated they can do patches, but what if the vendor contract specifically states that they will not modify their application program or software?
So a couple of things there, right? That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So a couple of things. Again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm just going to give you John's thoughts on this. Take it for whatever it's worth. One, warranties cannot trump patient safety. So if you honestly feel like, hey, there's a patient safety issue here, we got a Class B, Class C vulnerability, you're going to have to make a decision on do we patch or not patch. Right, and that's where these get to be very complicated conversations. Why I always recommend you got to get the C-suite involved, especially CMO, CNO, or Chief Quality Officer, because you probably don't want to be the person that makes a decision one way or the other. And time may not be your friend, right? Because you may need to make a decision like this, right? And we've seen this happen. Like, hey, I'm just going to use. Well, let's use the cath lab, right? Because that's a good one. That gets a lot of people's attention. So let's say you have a vulnerability in your cath lab where it's a Class B or C. It could bring patient safety issues in play. And the manufacturer's telling you, well, you can't do it because of blah, blah, blah. The next decision you've got to make, which is probably outside the scope of pretty much all of us on this call, I think, is do we shut down the cath lab, right? And if we don't shut it down, like what is the potential exposure? And this is where that list of things I gave you in terms of responsibility starts to come in. Okay, so let's say we do have a vulnerability in the cath lab, could lead to a patient safety issue. So first thing is, how serious of a patient safety issue, right? That's the first responsibility we have. Second, is our network shut to lockdown? Is there somebody actually going to be able to get to the cath lab and exploit this vulnerability? And I don't know the answer to that. That's something you would have to determine just in time, right? And understand your infrastructure and understand your attack surface and all of those things. I'm going to come back to attack surface in a moment. The third thing is then, okay, so this medical device, can it operate effectively if we don't patch it? Is it something else going on here? And then the last one is we got to inform patients. So if you got patients coming into the cath lab, you probably need to let them know, like, hey, just so you know, very low probability, but you know, this could be a risk. So that decision process has to happen very quickly, right? You don't want to be in a situation where, God forbid, you find a vulnerability or informed about one, you reach out to the vendor, they tell you, well, you know, you can't patch it or you're going to void the warranty. And now 2 days go by, 3 days go by before you get another response or you get legal involved or something. And God forbid, in that period of time, you do have a breach and somehow that cath lab gets hit and something happens to a patient, right? You're now in a very weird position, right? Where you knew about the vulnerability, you didn't do anything about it, you didn't inform patients, you didn't reduce risk. And guess what? That warranty doesn't really matter. You're not going to be able to go to court and say, oh, well, we would have patched it, but the warranty would have been violated. That's not a very defensible position. You probably don't want to be in a deposition or in a civil suit going through that. So you have to kind of look at all this as you need almost, and a lot of hospitals have this, right? You guys probably have the ability to spin up a command center or executive team to make decisions on critical issues. So, you know, it's all part of that risk management process. But this is, I guess, one thing to take away from all this is life's changed, right? We're now seeing civil liability become commonplace when it comes to cybersecurity threats. So you need to kind of change how we used to do things in the past. I would say even last year, year before, you could take a little more time trying to evaluate risk and getting a plan in place. Now, I don't know if I'd want to be in your shoes. Like, I don't really think I'd want to be one of you guys on that side of the equation and have to defend that, well, you know, here's the decision I made, but no, I didn't consult with my CMO or CNO, or, you know, it took us 2 or 3 days to get people together to think about what we want to do. And unfortunately, we got hit. So hopefully that answers it. I think it's an excellent question. If I didn't do a good job answering it, please let me know and I'll be happy to re-answer or restructure it. Anything else, Laura?
No more questions at this time.
Oh, well, here's what I wanted to add. Sorry, just attack surface management. So one thing, this is a new concept that is growing in momentum, and it goes back to the responsibilities that I just mentioned, right? So how do you know if your network is ultimately secure and in a manner that you know, you can lock it down? So one thing is to look at attack surface management offerings, right, which can look at your external environment and continually tell you if there's anything in the external environment that poses a significant risk to the internal environment. And that can help you then make informed decisions about how secure is the network, right? Because otherwise, without that sort of optic, you're just kind of going off of what you think the environment is, right? What you think is really locked down. And so looking into, as part of your security program, attack surface management is really, really important. So, and if that's something you guys want to talk about, please reach out to us and we can kind of talk to you about some ideas we have and some opportunities we may be having to work with you on it. But that is probably a key component, a key strategy we're seeing evolve. And you'll probably see it as commonplace in the next 2 to 3 years. So with that, sorry, Laura, but yep, that's all I have.
Okay, no more questions.
All right, everybody, thank you so very much. And hopefully this is helpful. If we can help, please reach out, and look forward to the next time we can get together. Bye.